She showed up with my late wife's engagement ring. I hadn't seen it in 7 years. I hadn't let myself think about it in almost as long. Because thinking about it meant thinking about the worst night of my life, the one where I drove home from the hospital alone, with the radio off, and my hands so tight on the wheel that my knuckles ached for 2 days afterward. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, a stranger stood on my porch holding out a small velvet box like it weighed nothing at all, and said, "You dropped this 7 years ago." I want to tell you what happened before that moment and what happened after, because both halves matter, and because I think if you have ever lost someone and built an entire careful life around the shape of that loss, you will understand exactly why a ring, showing up out of nowhere, can feel less like a gift and more like the floor giving way. My name is Marcus. I'm 38 years old, and for the last 7 years I have lived in a converted carriage house behind a larger property on the edge of a small town called Ashford Hollow, about 40 minutes outside the city. I'm an architect, which is a profession that rewards exactly the kind of person I became after my wife died. Someone who is good at structure, good at making things stand up correctly, good at problems that have a clean and knowable solution. A beam either holds the load or it doesn't. A foundation is either level or it isn't. I have spent 7 years inside that kind of certainty because the alternative, the part of life that does not resolve cleanly, the part that just keeps hurting in slow, irregular waves long after everyone else has stopped asking how you're doing. That part I learned early on not to look at directly. You get good at that. You get good at building a life with the lights pointed only at the parts that work. Her name was Elena. We were together 9 years, married for 4 of them, and she died on a Thursday in March from a brain aneurysm that gave no warning at all, no symptoms, no slow decline that might have let either of us prepare. She was 31. She had been making coffee. I was in the next room reading something on my laptop, and I heard a sound, not a scream, just a kind of soft collapse, the sound of someone going down without bracing for it, and by the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing anyone could have done, the doctor told me later. Nothing anyone could have done even if it had happened in a hospital instead of our kitchen. I have turned that fact over so many times in 7 years that it has gone smooth, the way a stone goes smooth in a river, and I don't know anymore whether knowing it was unpreventable made things better or worse. Maybe both. Maybe that's just what grief is. 2 true things sitting next to each other that never agree to reconcile. We had not yet found her engagement ring when I cleared out the house 8 months after she died. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only thing I have ever been able to offer this story instead of resolution. The ring had been hers before we were married, an heirloom from her grandmother, an old European cut diamond in a thin gold band that she wore on a chain around her neck more often than on her finger because she worked with her hands. She ran a small ceramic studio, and rings got in the way of the wheel. She had been wearing it on the chain the day she died. I was almost certain of that. But when I went through her things in the agonized, foggy weeks afterward, the necklace was there and the ring was not. I searched everywhere. I searched the studio, the car, the pockets of every coat, the gaps between couch cushions, the drain traps in both bathrooms, in a fit of late-night desperation that I am still slightly ashamed of. I hired someone, eventually, a woman who specialized in finding lost items for grieving families, which is a more common profession than you might think, and even she came up empty after 3 months of careful searching. I had to accept, somewhere in that first terrible year, that the ring was simply gone, lost in some mundane and unremarkable way that I would never have an answer for, and that not having an answer was going to be one more permanent feature of the loss, like a missing piece of a puzzle that you eventually frame anyway because you can't keep waiting for a piece that may not exist. So I built my life around the shape of that absence. I moved out of the house we had shared because I could not walk past the kitchen doorway without seeing the version of that Thursday that I had constructed in my mind from secondhand information, the version where I got there 1 second sooner. I bought the carriage house, small, well-built, easy to maintain, no kitchen doorway with any particular weight to it. I went back to work within 2 months because work was the only structure that still made sense. I dated, occasionally, in the 2nd and 3rd years, careful, brief, mutually unsatisfying arrangements that both people understood were not going anywhere, and eventually I stopped even trying that. I told myself I was at peace. I had, by most measurable standards, built a stable life. I had a good practice, a small circle of friends who had learned not to bring up March, a sister in Ohio who called every Sunday and never once, in 7 years, made me talk about anything I didn't want to talk about. I thought I had done the work. I thought grief, handled correctly, eventually became something you carried rather than something that carried you. I believed that, mostly, until a Tuesday evening in early October, when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway, and a woman I had never met got out of it holding a small black velvet box. Her name was Naomi Calloway. I learned that a few minutes after I learned everything else, because the ring came first. The ring took up the whole of my attention in a way that made introductions feel almost beside the point. She was maybe 35, dark hair pulled back loosely, the kind of plain, practical jacket that suggested she had come straight from somewhere, work boots, paint or clay dust, faintly visible on one knee of her jeans, that I noticed only later, and that turned out to matter more than I could have guessed. She stood at the bottom of my porch steps, didn't come up them, which I would come to understand was deliberate, a kind of respect for the threshold of a stranger's space. And she held the box out slightly and said the sentence that has not left me since. "You dropped this 7 years ago. I want to give it back to you." I did not move for what felt like a long time. I want to describe the feeling accurately because it was not what I would have predicted. It was not joy, not yet, not even relief. It was something closer to vertigo, the floor tilting slightly, every careful wall I had built over 7 years suddenly registering as exactly as provisional as it had always actually been. I said, "I don't understand." She said, "I think this belongs to your wife. May I ask her name?" I said Elena, and something moved across her face, a kind of confirmation she had clearly been braced for and dreading in equal measure. And she said, "I'm so sorry then. I had hoped I was wrong." I said, "Wrong about what?" She said, "I found this in a coat, a donated coat. 7 years ago, at the donation center where I used to volunteer, in the pocket of a wool coat that had been dropped off in a bag with about a dozen other items. I should have turned it straight in. I didn't. I'm sorry. I've carried that for a long time, and I finally tracked down who it might belong to." I sat down on the porch steps because my legs had stopped being entirely reliable. I asked her how. How do you track down the owner of a ring with no name on it, found 7 years ago, in a coat that could have come from anyone? She sat down too, at the bottom of the steps, a respectful distance away, and she told me the whole thing, and I am going to tell it to you the way she told it to me, because I have turned it over so many times since that I know it by heart. She said the ring had an inscription inside the band, very small, that she hadn't noticed for years because it required exact light and a magnifying glass to read clearly. 2 initials and a date, E and M, and a date in June that I recognized instantly as our wedding anniversary, the day I had given Elena this exact ring reset into a new setting as a surprise on our 4th anniversary, 3 months before she died, a private joke and a private promise between the two of us that nobody else would have known to look for. Naomi said she had kept the ring in a small box in her dresser for years, telling herself she would find the owner eventually, the way people tell themselves things to manage a guilt they're not ready to fully sit with. She said 2 months ago she had finally taken it to a jeweler to ask if the inscription could help identify a date range, just out of curiosity, just to finally do something about the weight of it. And the jeweler, an older man who had been in the business 40 years, recognized the craftsmanship of the resetting work. He said he didn't do that kind of fine engraving himself, but he knew exactly one person in the region who did, a metalsmith 2 towns over, and he gave her the name. Naomi drove out there. The metalsmith was retired but still kept records out of habit, the obsessive habit of someone who has spent a career being precise, and he pulled an old invoice from 7 years prior. An anniversary resetting job. A name, Marcus Hale. An address, the old house, the one I no longer lived in. From there it had been 3 weeks of careful, almost forensic work, asking neighbors, finding a forwarding address, confirming through a mutual acquaintance that I had, in fact, lost my wife not long after that anniversary, which told her with terrible clarity exactly what this ring had likely meant, and exactly why it had likely disappeared from a coat pocket no one ever checked. She said she had thought about mailing it. She said she couldn't bring herself to send something like this through the mail, to let it arrive in a cardboard box on an ordinary day with no one there to receive it the way it deserved to be received. So she drove out herself on a Tuesday evening after her own workday and stood at my porch steps and waited for me to open the door. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it would be simpler to tell you I felt only grateful, only moved, and that would not be the whole truth. I felt grief, fresh and total, the kind I had not felt with that particular sharpness in years, because here was the ring, here was the physical object I had spent 3 desperate months searching for in the worst period of my life, and its return meant nothing could be undone. It only confirmed how thoroughly it had all actually happened. I held the box in my hand and opened it on the porch steps in the October evening light, and there it was, the thin gold band, the old European cut stone, and I could see, even without the magnifying glass, the faint scratch of the inscription on the inside if I tilted it just right. E and M. June. I sat there for a long moment, not saying anything at all, and Naomi did not fill the silence, which I noticed and appreciated more than I had words for at the time. She just waited, the way you wait with someone in a hospital room, present but not intrusive, giving the moment exactly as much room as it needed. Eventually, I asked her to come up onto the porch properly. I made tea, badly, my hands not entirely steady, and we sat across from each other in the carriage house I had built specifically to not contain any memory of Elena, holding a ring that contained nothing but. I asked her about the donation center. What had made her keep the ring instead of turning it in immediately like she was supposed to? She said it had been a complicated year for her too, that she had been going through her own dissolution at the time, a divorce that had taken longer and cost more than either she or her ex-husband had expected, and that finding a ring like that, clearly significant, clearly precious to someone, had hit her at a moment when she was not in a position to think clearly about anything. She said she had told herself she would do the responsible thing eventually, and then eventually had quietly become years, the way it does. And the longer she carried it, the harder it became to imagine explaining the delay to whoever the ring belonged to, until the guilt itself became the reason for the silence, which she now understood was exactly backward. But understanding it backward hadn't made it easier to fix in the moment. I told her I understood that kind of logic better than she might expect. I told her about the 7 years of not looking directly at March, about how avoidance compounds the way interest does, quietly, until the principal you owe is unrecognizable from where you started. She left around 9 that evening, declining my offer of dinner with a gentleness that suggested she understood I needed the rest of the night alone, which I did, and which I was grateful she recognized without my having to say it. I sat up most of that night with the ring in my palm, turning it over, reading the inscription again and again under a small flashlight, like I needed to keep confirming it was real. I thought about Elena more directly and more completely that night than I had allowed myself to in years. Not the hospital, not the kitchen floor, but her, actually her. The way she used to wear the ring on the chain while she worked clay at the wheel, the small scar on her left thumb from a kiln accident in graduate school, the specific sound of her laugh when something struck her as genuinely funny rather than just polite, a laugh that started low and built fast. I had spent 7 years protecting myself from those memories by keeping the door to them mostly closed, and that night, for reasons I am still working out, the door came open, and instead of the devastation I had spent years bracing myself against, what I found on the other side was something closer to tenderness, grief that had finally been allowed to be about her, instead of only about the unbearable fact of her absence. Naomi texted 2 days later, a short message asking if I was doing all right, that she had thought about me and the ring more than she expected to since she left. I told her the truth, that I wasn't sure all right was the word, but that something had shifted that I thought, eventually, would turn out to be good. We started talking. Not constantly, not in any way either of us would have called significant at the time, but regularly, the kind of slow, accumulating correspondence that builds without either party quite naming it. She told me more about her own life. She ran a small ceramic studio 2 towns over, which struck both of us as a strange coincidence worth sitting with for a moment, given Elena's work, though Naomi was careful and I was grateful for the care, not to lean into that coincidence as though it meant something larger than it did. She had 2 kids from her marriage, 12 and 9, who lived with her on alternating weeks. She had been divorced 4 years and had, by her own account, done a reasonable job of building a stable life out of the wreckage of one that hadn't worked. Though she said this with the specific weariness of someone who knows that stable and whole are not the same word, a distinction I recognized immediately because I had been living inside it myself for 7 years. About 3 weeks after she first showed up at my porch, she asked if I wanted to see the donation center where she'd found the coat, which I understood was less about the physical location and more about her wanting to close a loop that had clearly been sitting unresolved in her for a long time. We drove out together on a Saturday afternoon. It was an unremarkable building, the kind of place that exists in every town, fluorescent lights and racks of secondhand clothing, organized with more care than people generally assume. She showed me roughly where the donation bins had been 7 years before, the building having been renovated twice since then, and she told me, standing in that ordinary space, the rest of what she remembered about the day she found the ring. She had been sorting a bag of winter coats, a wool coat with a frayed cuff, reached into the pocket out of habit because people leave things in pockets constantly, gloves and receipts, and once, memorably, a folded $50 bill, and felt the small, hard shape of the box. She said she remembered sitting down on an overturned crate in the back room and opening it and feeling immediately that this was not an object that had been donated on purpose. Some things people give away easily. This was not one of them. She said she had wondered, in that very first moment, 7 years ago, what had happened to the person it belonged to, whether they knew it was gone, whether they were looking for it right at that moment, somewhere, desperate and not finding it. I told her they had been. I told her about the 3 months of searching, the woman I'd hired, the drains, and the couch cushions, and she went quiet for a long moment in that fluorescent-lit donation center, and then she said, "I'm so sorry it took me this long." I told her I understood why it had, that I didn't think there was any version of this where the timing could have felt right to her, that 7 years or 7 months, the apology would have landed the same way for both of us, with the same impossible mixture of grief and gratitude. She asked if I was angry. I thought about the question honestly before I answered, because I owed her an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. I said I had been angry, briefly, that first night, not really at her, but at the universe in general, at the absurdity of losing something so important to something so random, a coat pocket, a donation bin, the dumb mechanical churn of how things actually get lost and found in the world. But I said the anger hadn't lasted, because underneath it was something larger, which was that the ring had come back at all, against every reasonable expectation, carried for 7 years, by someone who could have just as easily sold it, or kept it, or thrown it away in a moment of overwhelm and never thought about it again. She had carried the weight of it instead. That meant something to me that I didn't fully have words for yet. We kept talking through the autumn. I noticed, somewhere around November, that I had started looking forward to her texts in a way that had nothing to do with the ring anymore, that I was thinking about her, specifically her, the particular way she described her work at the wheel, the dry humor she used when talking about her kids' increasingly elaborate negotiating tactics, the fact that she had once driven 4 hours round trip to track down a metalsmith's old invoice because she could not stand the idea of a guilt sitting unaddressed in a drawer. I recognized, with the specific dread of someone who has spent 7 years building a life designed not to feel this particular thing, that I was developing feelings for her. And I did not know what to do with that recognition because it arrived tangled up with Elena in a way that felt, at first, almost like a betrayal of the very thing that had brought us together. I told my sister about this on one of our Sunday calls, the first time in 7 years I had brought up anything close to this territory voluntarily. She listened the way she always did, without rushing to fill silence, and when I finished, she asked a single question that stayed with me for days afterward. She asked, "Do you think Elena would have wanted you to spend the rest of your life standing guard over a closed door?" I didn't have an answer right away. I have thought about that question more than almost any other question anyone has asked me in 7 years, and the answer I eventually arrived at, slowly, over weeks, was no. Elena had been, in life, a person who threw herself completely into things, who did not believe in half measures, who used to tell me that the worst thing you could do with a single life was spend it protecting yourself from feeling anything at all. She would not have wanted a shrine. She would have wanted, I came to believe, exactly what I was beginning to feel guilty about wanting, which was simply more life. I met Naomi for dinner properly in December, the first time either of us called it what it was, instead of letting it hide inside the language of just talking. It was a small restaurant in her town, candlelit in the unpretentious way of a place that's been doing this a long time and doesn't need to perform it. I told her, early in the dinner, that I needed to say something honestly before we went any further, and she put her fork down and gave me her full attention in the way I had come to recognize as fundamentally her. The same attention she'd given the moment on my porch steps, patient and unhurried and entirely present. I told her that I didn't want her to ever feel like she was a replacement for someone, that whatever this was becoming between us needed to be its own thing entirely, separate from Elena, not built on top of the ring or the loss or the strange and improbable way we had found each other. I said I needed her to know that I saw her, specifically her, not as a chapter that happened to follow a tragedy. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have carried with me since. She said she had worried about the exact same thing from her side, that she had spent weeks second-guessing whether what she felt for me was real, or whether it was some complicated knot of guilt and grief, and the strange intimacy of having been the one to return something so significant that maybe she was confusing relief at finally being forgiven with something that felt like more than it was. She said she had decided, somewhere in November, that the only way to actually know was to stop overthinking it and pay attention to what was true on an ordinary Tuesday, when nothing dramatic was happening. Just two people having dinner, just two people texting about nothing. And what she had found, in those ordinary moments, was that she liked me. Not the story. Me. The way I talked about architecture with my hands moving like I was sketching in the air. The way I had listened to her, completely, in that fluorescent donation center, instead of making the moment only about my own loss. She said that was real, as far as she could tell, and she trusted it. We have been together 2 years now. I want to tell you honestly that it was not simple, that the early months involved a great deal of careful, sometimes clumsy negotiation about what it meant to build something new, while still honoring something that had ended so abruptly and so completely. There were nights I woke up disoriented, reaching toward a side of the bed that had been empty for years and then suddenly wasn't, and had to sit with the strange vertigo of that change before I could settle back into it. There were moments Naomi needed reassurance that she understood, correctly, that loving me did not require erasing 7 years of my life that came before her, that she was not in competition with a memory, because memories don't shift or grow or surprise you, and she very much wanted, reasonably, to be loved as a living, changing person, rather than measured against someone frozen at 31 forever. We talked about all of this directly, more directly than either of us had talked about almost anything in our previous relationships, because we both understood, from very different directions, exactly how much damage avoidance can do if you let it compound long enough. The ring sits in a small box in my dresser drawer now, not worn, not displayed, just kept, the way you keep something that matters too much to use casually and too much to put away entirely. I think about giving it to my sister someday, or keeping it for a future I haven't fully imagined yet, a daughter perhaps, someone down the line who might want a piece of family history with an old inscription and a story attached to it stranger than most family stories get. Naomi has her own ring now, one I picked out carefully and nervously over several weeks last spring, nothing to do with Elena's at all, a different stone entirely. A thin modern band that Naomi chose herself after I told her I wanted her to have something that was completely, unambiguously hers. We got married in September, small, in her studio actually, surrounded by half-finished ceramic pieces on shelves, and the particular smell of clay and kiln heat that I have come to associate, now, with both of the women I have loved in this life, in entirely different ways, for entirely different reasons. People sometimes ask me, when they hear the story, whether it felt like fate, the ring finding its way back through a coat pocket, and a metalsmith's old invoice, and a woman who could not let her own guilt rest unaddressed. I don't know if I believe in fate exactly, not in the tidy way the word usually gets used. But I believe that some people carry things carefully even when they don't have to, and that the carrying itself becomes a kind of bridge, and that grief, if you let it, can crack a door open, instead of only ever closing one. I lost my wife on an ordinary Thursday in March, with no warning at all. I found, 7 years later, on an ordinary Tuesday in October, that the things we lose do not always stay lost, and that the people who find them sometimes turn out to be carrying more for us than we ever could have guessed, more than just an old gold ring with a small inscription worn nearly smooth by 7 years in a dark drawer, waiting for someone honest enough to finally bring it home. There is a part of this I have not told many people, not because it is a secret exactly, but because it is hard to say out loud without it sounding like more than it is. A few months after Naomi and I started seeing each other properly, before the wedding, before any of the larger conversations about what our life together would actually look like, I went back to the old house. The one Elena and I had shared. I had not been inside it in 7 years, not since the week I packed my things and left. But the new owners, a young couple with a toddler and a second child on the way, had reached out through a mutual friend because they were renovating the kitchen and had found something behind a cabinet that they thought might belong to the previous owner. I assumed it would be nothing, an old receipt, a forgotten spice jar pushed to the back of a shelf. I drove out on a Saturday morning with a strange, low hum of dread in my chest that I hadn't expected, because I had told myself for years that the house no longer held any power over me, that I had successfully relocated all the weight of that loss into a carriage house with no kitchen doorway of any particular significance. I was wrong about that, as it turned out, in a way that felt important to sit with rather than rush past. The young couple were kind, a little nervous in the way people are when they know they are handing a stranger something emotionally loaded. The husband led me into the kitchen, which had been completely redone. New cabinets, new counters, nothing left of the room I remembered except the window over the sink, the one Elena used to stand at while the coffee brewed, looking out at the yard. He handed me a small cloth bag. Inside was a ceramic bowl, unmistakably hers, one of her early studio pieces, glazed in a deep, uneven blue that she had always loved and never quite been able to replicate again, no matter how many times she tried the same recipe. It must have rolled behind the old cabinet years before, forgotten in the chaos of those final weeks before I moved out, when I packed boxes without looking closely at half of what went into them, because looking closely at any of it felt unbearable at the time. I stood in that new kitchen, in a house that no longer resembled the one I had grieved inside, holding a bowl Elena had made with her own hands, and I cried in a way I had not let myself cry in years. Not the controlled, private grief I had rationed out carefully over 7 years, but something larger and less managed. The young couple, to their enormous credit, simply let me have the moment, the husband quietly suggesting his wife go check on their toddler in the other room, giving me the space without making it awkward. When I finally collected myself, I thanked them more than the moment probably required, and I drove home with the bowl on the passenger seat, wrapped carefully in the cloth bag, and I understood something on that drive that I had not fully understood before. The house had not been holding Elena hostage all those years. I had simply not been ready to walk back into any room that still had her in it, not the literal kitchen, but any space, internal or otherwise, where her absence and her presence both lived at the same time, without resolving into one clean feeling I could file away and move past. I gave the bowl to Naomi a few weeks later, not as a gift exactly, more as a way of finally letting her see the whole shape of what she had married into. I told her the story of the visit, the cabinet, the tears in a stranger's renovated kitchen. She held the bowl carefully, turned it over to look at the maker's mark Elena used to press into the base of every piece she finished, and she said something I think about often. She said, "I don't need you to love her less for me to feel loved completely. I just need you to keep letting me see all of it, even the parts that don't have anywhere clean to go." I think that sentence did more to settle whatever quiet anxiety I still carried about blending these two halves of my life than anything else either of us said in those early months. The bowl sits on a shelf in our kitchen now, the one in the house we bought together last year. Not hidden, not shrined, just present, the way a person's whole history should probably be allowed to sit in a life that's still being built. Naomi's children have grown attached to me in the slow, undramatic way kids attach to a steady adult presence over time, more through shared dinners and homework help and an ongoing, increasingly competitive card game tournament than through any single defining moment. The older one, Theo, asked me once, with the casual directness only a 12-year-old can manage, whether I had loved my first wife as much as I love his mom. I told him the truth, which is that love isn't really a competition with a scoreboard, that I loved Elena completely in the 9 years I had with her, and I love his mother completely now, and that both of those things are allowed to be true at the same time without canceling each other out, the same way he can love both of his parents fully even though they are no longer married to each other. He thought about that for a while and then asked if he could have the last slice of pizza, which I took as a sign the conversation had landed somewhere he could actually rest in, the particular grace of a kid who asks the hard question and then lets it go once he has an honest answer. Naomi still volunteers at the same donation center where she found the ring, though she has changed her own policy since, she tells me, with a small private joke we share now. Anything found in a pocket goes immediately into the lost and found log. No exceptions, no quiet decisions made alone in a back room on an overturned crate. She says she thinks about that younger version of herself sometimes, mid-divorce, overwhelmed, making a choice she knew even then wasn't quite right. And she has made a kind of peace with that version of herself, the same way I have made peace with the version of myself who searched drains and couch cushions for 3 increasingly desperate months. We are both, I think, people who understand now that the things we carry imperfectly, the choices we make in the worst stretches of our lives, do not have to define the whole of who we become afterward. Sometimes they just become the strange, improbable bridge that gets you to the rest of your life, if you let them. I think about the ring most on our anniversary, the new one, the date Naomi and I chose for our own wedding, which we picked deliberately in September, nowhere near June. A small, private decision that mattered more to both of us than we ever discussed directly. I take it out of the drawer sometimes on quiet evenings, turn it over under the kitchen light, read the inscription that started all of this, E and M, a date in June that belongs to a different chapter now. A closed one, a complete one. I am not the same man who searched his own drains at 2 a.m. 7 years ago, certain that finding the ring would somehow undo what had happened, that recovering the object might recover something else along with it. I know now that nothing recovers what was actually lost, but I also know that a stranger's careful, guilty, 7-year decision to finally make something right can crack a door open you didn't even fully realize you had sealed shut, and that what waits on the other side of that door is not always more grief. Sometimes, if you are patient and honest and willing to walk through it slowly, what waits there is simply more life, arriving the way most important things actually arrive, not with fanfare, but on an ordinary Tuesday evening, in the shape of someone standing at the bottom of your porch steps, holding out exactly what you didn't know you were still allowed to hope for.